Plato, born in Athens in 427 BC, is celebrated as one of the greatest minds in history. But buried in the Republic, his most famous work, is a cold and uncomfortable vision of society that doesn't look so flattering for the poor. Plato believed the ideal state should be divided into rigid classes. At the top, the philosopher kings, wise rulers who alone could grasp truth. Beneath them, the auxiliaries, soldiers who maintained order. At the very bottom, the producers, the farmers, artisans, and laborers. These were the masses who worked, paid, and kept the machine running. For Plato, they had no real share in ruling or shaping society. Their role was to serve, not to lead. He even suggested strict censorship of art and culture, and lifelong education systems to keep people locked into their assigned class. Justice, according to Plato, wasn't equality. It was everyone staying in their proper place. The poor weren't victims, they were simply fulfilling the position nature assigned them. This is where the controversy hits. Was Plato honestly describing a harsh reality to keep society stable, or was he handing elites the first manual of propaganda, assuring them the poor deserve nothing beyond obedience? His vision gave centuries of rulers intellectual cover for inequality, and that debate still burns today.
Aristotle, born in 384 BC, was one of history's most influential philosophers, but also one of the most unapologetic defenders of inequality. In his politics, he didn't just accept hierarchy, he justified it. Aristotle argued that some people were natural slaves. They lacked the rational capacity to rule themselves and were supposedly better off being commanded. For him, slavery wasn't just an accident of war or conquest, it was rooted in nature itself. That logic placed free Greek men at the top, while women, foreigners, and slaves were fixed at the bottom. In Aristotle's view, their role was to labor so elites could pursue the higher virtues of politics, philosophy, and art. He also claimed that inequality between rich and poor was essential for stability. Poverty wasn't an injustice, it was simply the condition meant for many. His followers, over centuries, seized on these words as moral armor for oppression. Roman jurists cited him to justify slavery. Medieval rulers and colonial empires echoed his authority to chain millions of people. When asked why such brutality persisted, defenders pointed back to Aristotle and his claim that some were born to serve. That leaves the uncomfortable question. Was Aristotle presenting a clear-eyed view of human differences, or did he provide history's most elegant excuse for keeping the poor and enslaved exactly where they were? That's the paradox built into his legacy.
Thomas Aquinas, 1225 to 1274. Thomas Aquinas, born in 1225, was a Christian theologian who reshaped medieval philosophy by blending Aristotle with Catholic doctrine. But while remembered as a saint and intellectual giant, his vision of poverty shows how religion often defended inequality as natural. Aquinas argued that social hierarchy was part of the divine plan. The poor existed to labor, while the wealthy existed to rule and provide charity. To him, that wasn't injustice, it was harmony. The hungry man working in the fields and the nobleman distributing alms were both performing their God-given roles. Poverty in Aquinas' system was less tragedy and more necessity. It gave the rich an opportunity to practice virtue through generosity. This theology effectively locked inequality into place. If the poor suffered, it wasn't society's failing, it was God's will. And if the rich held power, it wasn't exploitation, it was natural order. For centuries, kingdoms and churches leaned on Aquinas' authority to keep rigid structures fixed, reinforcing the idea that rebellion against poverty was rebellion against God himself. His defenders say he softened inequality by demanding charity from the rich. His critics argue he sanctified poverty and made oppression holy. And here's the core dilemma. Was Aquinas offering spiritual comfort to a broken world, or creating theology that told the poor their suffering was exactly what they deserved?
Niccolò Machiavelli, born in Florence in 1469, lived in the chaos of warring city-states, betrayal, and fragile rulers. Out of that turmoil came The Prince, a handbook for leaders who cared about survival more than morality. And Machiavelli didn't mince words.
A ruler who relied on loyalty from the masses was doomed. To stay safe, he suggested the masses should remain weak, poor, and dependent. For Machiavelli, fear was more reliable than love. Poverty among the people meant they were too preoccupied with survival to challenge authority. Wealth or independence, in contrast, bred ambition, and ambition bred rebellion. His advice was brutal: control resources, manipulate appearances, and keep the masses just comfortable enough to work, but never empowered enough to rise. Centuries of rulers, dictators, and even modern politicians cherry-picked his ruthless lines to justify economic control, censorship, and state manipulation of the poor. Machiavelli never said cruelty should be random, but he made cruelty sound like good governance. So the question lingers: was Machiavelli simply exposing harsh political truth, or giving rulers the perfect excuse to keep the poor broken, weak, and obedient? His legacy still divides readers as either brave realism or the ultimate playbook for elitist control.
Jean Bodin, born in 1530, was a French political thinker who became one of the great defenders of monarchy. Writing during wars of religion and civil unrest, Bodin argued that strong authority was the only way to hold society together. But part of that order, he claimed, depended on keeping the masses poor. For Bodin, poverty among common people wasn't a failure of the state, it was what made the state stable. If everyone were wealthy and comfortable, they might demand power, resist authority, or disrupt the delicate balance. But when the majority struggled to survive, they remained obedient, reliant, and predictable. In his view, inequality wasn't an unfortunate accident, it was a tool to preserve peace. This hard logic gave monarchs and elites justification for suppressing uprisings, hoarding wealth, and branding poverty not as injustice, but as necessity. For centuries afterward, Bodin's defensive hierarchy insulated rulers against calls for equality. So, was Bodin simply a realist, pointing out that wealth breeds rebellion? Or was he openly writing the blueprint for elites to keep people desperate? That's the edge of his legacy.
Thomas Hobbes. Born in 1588, lived through brutal civil war in England, chaos that shaped his famously bleak view of human nature. In his masterpiece Leviathan, Hobbes wrote that life without authority would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. For Hobbes, humans left alone were selfish, violent, and prone to endless conflict. The solution wasn't liberty, it was absolute authority. A strong ruler, even a tyrant, was better than instability. Equality of power among the masses was nothing but a recipe for civil war. So Hobbes dismissed the idea of equal freedom and instead elevated hierarchy and submission as the only path to peace. Across history, that gave kings, dictators, and authoritarian regimes fuel to justify crushing dissent and keeping common people under strict control. If human beings were destined to fight without a ruler, then poverty and powerlessness became the natural lot of the majority. But here's the dilemma. Was Hobbes offering brutal honesty about human survival, or was he excusing endless repression by insisting ordinary people could never govern themselves? His words still split debate today.
Bernard Mandeville, born in 1670, shook Europe with one of the most controversial works of his time, The Fable of the Bees. Its provocative message: vice, greed, and inequality don't corrupt society, they fuel it. In his allegory, a beehive prospers because every bee pursues selfish desires. When the bees suddenly become virtuous, the hive collapses into poverty. The lesson was explosive. Public good depends on private vice. Inequality, poverty, and greed weren't moral failures, they were the hidden engine of progress. Mandeville argued that the poor were essential. They did the labor, provided cheap services, and kept economies running. If everyone were rich and virtuous, trade would collapse, innovation would die, and society would stagnate. Luxury for the few required necessity for the many. His critics called him immoral, even blasphemous for glorifying selfishness. But his defenders hailed him as an early realist of capitalism, anticipating how consumer desire and inequality keep economies in motion.
So was Mandeville exposing a hard truth that poverty drives prosperity? Or was he simply dressing up exploitation as necessity? His parables still spark argument centuries later.
Friedrich Nietzsche, born in 1844, was one of philosophy's most explosive figures. He dismissed conventional morality as slave morality, built by the weak to chain the strong. He celebrated the rise of the Übermensch, the individual who breaks free, creates his own values, and towers above the herd. For Nietzsche, the poor, the weak, the resentful masses, what he called the herd, were life-denying. Uplifting them was not noble, it was destructive because it kept society chained to mediocrity. He scorned pity, warning it only preserved what nature was trying to eliminate. Instead, he glorified strength, vitality, and overcoming, even if that meant leaving the weakest to collapse. While Nietzsche didn't write policy, his writing carried raw contempt for weakness, making generations interpret him as saying the poor deserve their fate simply by lacking the power to transcend it. Later, Nazis twisted his words for genocidal ends, though Nietzsche himself opposed anti-Semitism. So here's the provocation. Was Nietzsche a prophet demanding humanity rise above its limits? Or did he hand history a philosophy that sneered at the suffering poor as expendable herd animals? His words still divide fiercely today. David Hume, born in 1711 in Scotland, was one of the great minds of the Enlightenment. But when it came to wealth and inequality, he was blunt. Not only was inequality inevitable, it might actually be useful. Hume argued that societies with distribution of ranks and fortunes worked better because inequality gave people something to strive for. The ambition of the poor to rise and the need to serve wealthier patrons created what he saw as a healthier, more productive public economy. In his eyes, some would always be rich and others poor, and that imbalance, far from being a tragedy, was what kept society in motion. Centuries later, defenders of capitalism loved Hume for framing inequality as natural and functional. Critics, on the other hand, see him as an apologist, one more philosopher telling the poor their suffering is necessary so that elites can enjoy stability. So how do we see Hume's words today? As a hard truth about human ambition, or a convenient excuse for keeping people locked in poverty? That tension still defines his legacy.
Adam Smith, born in 1723, is often called the father of economics. His landmark book, The Wealth of Nations, laid down principles of free markets, specialization, and self-interest as forces that drive prosperity. But buried in his sympathy for laborers was a reality check. Poverty and inequality would always shadow economic growth. Smith argued markets worked because people freely exchanged their labor and goods, but he also admitted that hierarchies were inevitable. Employers would nearly always have more power than workers, wealth would pool among certain classes, and poverty could never be erased, only managed. While Smith called for education and fair treatment to ease hardship, he didn't believe in equality of outcome. He saw some poverty as simply a byproduct of a functioning economy. This duality made Smith a hero to defenders of capitalism, but a disappointment to idealists. He recognized the workers' pain, yet accepted inequality as structural. So was Adam Smith the honest architect of modern prosperity, or a philosopher who blessed a system knowing many would remain poor so some could thrive? That debate still defines how we read him today.
Edmund Burke, born in 1729, is remembered as the great critic of the French Revolution. Where radical thinkers demanded equality in the end of aristocracy, Burke warned that overturning natural hierarchies would lead only to chaos and bloodshed. For Burke, inequality wasn't a flaw, it was the very foundation of society. He believed that different ranks, classes, and traditions created stability. The masses, in his view, had no place tearing down structures they didn't understand. Obedience and deference to the ruling elite was not oppression, but order, woven into the very fabric of nature. His scathing attack on revolutionary ideals in Reflections on the Revolution in France shaped conservative thought for centuries. Monarchs and elites happily quoted Burke to remind the poor that rebellion was dangerous and equality a dangerous dream. The question is whether Burke was a realist who saw the horrors of revolution clearly, or an apologist for privilege who told the poor to accept their chains as natural. That argument hasn't gone away. In fact, it's still alive in every clash of revolution and conservatism today.
Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, born in 1770, built one of the most complex systems of philosophy in history. For him, the state wasn't just politics. It was the highest expression of human freedom. But within this lofty vision sat a darker argument. Inequality wasn't only unavoidable, it was necessary. Hegel divided people into social roles, arguing that freedom wasn't the same for everyone. True citizenship, he said, required property and participation in civil life. Those without property, the dispossessed he called the rabble, were excluded. In his eyes, the very poor lacked the independence to act as free citizens, leaving them destined for dependency or unrest. The remedy wasn't overturning inequality, it was tightening the structure of the state so order was maintained. This distinction cast poverty not as injustice, but as a condition outside freedom itself. Later thinkers, both revolutionary and authoritarian, used Hegel to argue that poor, landless masses either needed guidance by elites or deserved their marginalization altogether. So, was Hegel offering insight into how society functions, or was he writing off the poor as unworthy of liberty? That's the sharp question buried inside his philosophy of freedom.
Herbert Spencer, born in 1820 in England, took Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection and extended it far beyond biology. The result was social Darwinism, a philosophy that declared inequality was simply nature at work. Spencer claimed the rich and powerful were fitter, while the poor and weak were unfit. Poverty, illness, and suffering weren't moral outrages to him, they were evidence of natural law. To interfere by helping the poor, he argued, was not charity but sabotage. It slowed down evolution and rewarded failure. Survival of the fittest, he believed, applied to societies, economies, and individuals alike. These ideas spread quickly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, justifying brutal labor practices, colonial conquest, and resistance to social reform. For elites and industrialists, Spencer's logic was a moral shield. Why worry about poverty when nature had already decided who deserved to thrive? Critics see Spencer as dressing cruelty up as science. Defenders argue he was simply consistent, applying Darwinian logic wherever it led. The larger question is unavoidable. Was Spencer a realist revealing how the world works, or the intellectual who told generations of rulers the poor deserved to die off? William Graham Sumner, born in 1840 in the United States, became the loudest American voice of social Darwinism. Like Herbert Spencer, he argued that society followed the laws of evolution, and anyone poor, weak, or broken was simply failing to adapt. Sumner despised welfare and charity programs, insisting they only rewarded laziness. His most infamous phrase summed it up: "The drunkard in the gutter is just where he ought to be." In his view, poverty was a sign of weakness, not injustice. The state had no business rescuing failures from the consequences of their own choices. Industrial America's elite seized on Sumner's words to shield themselves from criticism. Inequality, mass poverty, brutal labor conditions, such things weren't moral problems to fix, but proof that the system was working as nature intended. This turned Sumner into one of the harshest intellectual defenders of laissez-faire capitalism. Was he exposing an ugly truth about human responsibility, or was he writing off human suffering as deserved punishment?
That's the brutal legacy of his philosophy. Ayn Rand, born in Russia in 1905 and later immigrating to America, built a philosophy she called objectivism, a fierce defense of reason, self-interest, and capitalism. Her novels Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead made her famous, while essays like The Virtue of Selfishness made her infamous. Rand attacked altruism, declaring that need is not a claim. The poor, she argued, had no moral entitlement to wealth they didn't earn. To her, the creators, the inventors, entrepreneurs, and producers, were society's lifeblood, while the dependent masses were parasites draining the strong. In Atlas Shrugged, she dramatized this idea. When the most productive individuals withdraw, society collapses. Her moral was blunt. Society exists for the benefit of the successful, not for the weak. Critics called this cruel, celebrating greed while abandoning compassion. Defenders claimed she was simply telling the truth. Rewarding weakness destroys progress. Rand's philosophy lit a cultural war that continues into the present. Was she the champion of individual freedom against collectivist tyranny, or a ruthless ideologue who dressed up selfishness and let the poor rot? That clash defines her polarizing legacy.